Welcome to Better Without Billboards, a podcast from Ad-Free Cities all about outdoor advertising, why it's bad, and what we can do to reclaim our public spaces.
In today's episode, James and Nicola discuss high-carbon ad bans, or bans on adverts for highly polluting products like fossil fuels, cars and flights. James speaks to a councillor in Edinburgh, a city that recently introduced such a ban. What is the effect of such policies? Can other cities do the same? And what would it take for us to see a national high-carbon ad ban? Let's join Nicola and James to find out more.
Welcome to the Better Without Billboards podcast. I'm Nicola.
And I'm James.
And today we're talking about advertising that's driving the climate crisis. So this includes advertising for fossil fuels, airlines, polluting cars, meat and dairy. Often we call this high carbon advertising. And we're talking today about what's being done on a local level to address the harms caused by this kind of advertising. Now, James, you spoke to artist Darren Cullen in a previous episode about the likes of Shell and the misinformation and the harm caused by their misleading marketing. So listeners, do check that episode out. That was back in July. And now we're talking about what can be done about it. Now, one approach is for local councils to stop high carbon advertising in our towns and cities. So, James, let's talk a little bit about what councils are doing, and then you can tell us who we're speaking to this week.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's start at the beginning and the idea of prohibiting ads for harmful products in the first place, because in itself it's nothing new, right? I mean, we banned ads for tobacco many, many years ago, and I think you'd be very hard pressed today to find anyone who thought that we should bring back cigarette ads, right? So we accept the logic there. Cigarettes are really, really harmful. Ads for cigarettes drive consumption of those products and therefore drive harm, and therefore we ban the ads. But cigarettes are, of course, not the only harmful product on the market, nor are they uniquely harmful in their effects. Alcohol, gambling, junk food are all in many ways just as bad, as are fossil fuels.
Yeah, right. Now, and over 5 million people die each year from air pollution directly attributable to fossil fuels. That was according to a study in the British Medical Journal last year. So let's talk about how tackling advertising can help with that.
Yeah, so this is where the idea of a high carbon ad ban comes in. So we know that advertising drives consumption of a product. And if that product relies on fossil fuels, like a car or a flight, then advertising that product means raising emissions. So there's a fantastic group called Purpose Disruptors who have done research actually quantifying this. And what they found is that a stunning kind of statistic, but basically a third of each of our carbon footprints is caused by this kind of uplift from advertising, right? So if it weren't for advertising, we could cut a massive amount of our total carbon emissions as a, well, here in the UK as a nation, but around the world as well, this still has an effect. So the purpose of a high carbon ad ban is to treat ads for high carbon products the same way as we do for cigarettes and tobacco, to reduce their presence in our lives, and through doing so, reduce demand and consumption, and ultimately reduce harm.
Yeah. Now, earlier this year, we heard Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, give a speech where he called out the madmen fueling the madness. In other words, the advertisers who promote fossil fuels and fossil fuel companies. And that's what he was talking about, right?
Exactly. So in that speech, Antonio Guterres basically argued that the fossil fuel industry is propped up by all kinds of behind-the-scenes influences like lobbyists, PR people, and the advertising industry. Now, one thing we sometimes talk about on this podcast and in our work more generally is the idea of social license, or how certain things like products, industries, or certain activities are considered normal and acceptable basically just because they happen and because they've always happened. Even if they're harmful, they kind of get a pass, right? That's what we mean by social license. Advertising is a major part of generating that social license. We see so many ads every day all around us, often without even noticing, and they are designed very precisely to generate positive feelings about the thing being advertised. So even if you don't care about that thing, you're still going to go away with those positive associations. And that's the other side of a high carbon ad ban. It's not just about reducing how much people buy per se, it's about reducing the social license of fossil fuel companies and in turn of fossil fuels themselves. And then again, that makes the general transition, right, this more like widespread holistic transition away from fossil fuels much, much easier.
Right, okay. So what does it actually look like? Do we think a high carbon ad ban is really something for national governments?
Yep, yeah. So we would love to see the UK government introduce such a ban, a tobacco-style national ban on fossil fuel advertising. And that's what Antonio Guterres was kind of gunning for in his speech that we talked about. But that's, very aspirational, right? National legislation takes a long time. In the meantime, local governments can take action and they can introduce bans at a smaller scale. So councils and transport authorities, like Transport for London, often control quite a lot of advertising space through billboards, through bus shelters, through the ads that you see on buses and on trains, as well as sponsorship opportunities, like when a business sponsors a public event. Through what are usually called advertising and sponsorship policies, local authorities can create high carbon ad bans, reducing ads for polluting products on our streets.
Okay, and to learn more about this, you spoke to a councillor in Edinburgh, right?
I did indeedio. Back in May this year, Edinburgh City Council passed a motion to introduce a high carbon ad ban into their existing advertising and sponsorship policy. Now, that followed hot on the heels of Sheffield Council, who did the same. In addition to councils like Cambridgeshire, Coventry, Basingstoke and Dean, Somerset as well, I think, have all introduced some kind of restriction on fossil fuel advertising and sponsorship. But those Sheffield and Edinburgh policies really kind of go a little bit further just in their scope. So to find out more, I spoke to Ben Parker, an Edinburgh councillor with the Scottish Greens, who, along with his colleague, Councillor Alice Mumford, was one of the real driving forces behind the Edinburgh high carbon ad policy.
Great. So let's hear that conversation now.
Brilliant. Ben, thank you very much for joining me today. Welcome to Better Without Billboards.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
All right, fantastic, Ben. So we are talking today about the amazing, trailblazing Edinburgh high carbon ad ban policy that was passed earlier this year. And I guess I wanted to start with just asking a little bit about the kind of motivation for it, because it was a couple of years in the pipeline before it got passed by the council. So, where did it come from? And I guess of all the things that you could spend your time on, why did outdoor advertising and sponsorship feel like something important to worry about? Yeah,
so you are absolutely right that this was a couple of years in the making. I suppose this is a terrible answer to your question, but the reason why we picked on it initially was because we thought it might be one of those quick wins that you can just get, quick and finished within a couple of months, but it didn't turn out that way. But no, I mean, I guess the general motivation for us looking at the advertising and sponsorship policy within the council was because we felt like there was definitely a really big disconnect between all of the things that the council was saying in terms of climate and nature recovery, all of the things that we'd said, particularly in terms of what's happening in Palestine at the moment and the genocide there, and an advertising and sponsorship policy which was completely blind and actually in some cases, working to the detriment of all of those other policies. So actually, if we've said lots of positive things about a ceasefire in Palestine, if we've got a commitment to the climate emergency and to the nature emergency, why would we not want to see that continued into the sort of corporate policies that the council has, so things like advertising and sponsorship. So, it's really about making sure that we have that consistent approach across everything that the council does.
Yeah, and that's so important. And in the council debate, when you were passing this motion, your colleague Alice Mumford spoke about that need for joined up thinking. So, I mean, to what extent do you feel that is, I guess, recognised within the council and within local government? Do other councillors see the joins between the dots, or did you really have to make the case for that to get it across the line?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, isn't it? How much do I want to throw my colleagues under the bus? No, I think that lots of people in the council recognise the disconnect. I think the difficulty is that the council is such a large organisation, and there are so many different things running at different points in time. That we don't always see as much joined-up thinking as we would like. But then I guess that's the role of local councillors. That's the point of electing people into these positions with particular policy positions, because, when I was taking on the climate environment portfolio for the Greens. That was my role for the past couple of years. So I was looking at every single bit of the council to try and identify, well, where are the gaps? So I suppose it's that kind of collective effort. I think it's worth saying that we didn't have unanimous agreement in the council that we would want to make this policy change. The Conservatives were sort of dead set against it. They were making the argument, I think, that individuals had the right to be advertised to by fossil fuel companies. That strikes me as particularly absurd. And again, given the fact that the council has got other commitments, we have a business plan which sets out our top 3 priorities, which are to end poverty and to deliver a net zero city. I don't think there's much justification for having other policies in the council like advertising sponsorship, which aren't, which don't pay due attention to that. So I think that there's obviously we got the policy passed, so that means that there is a majority view in favour of that joined up thinking, but also there is a diversity of opinion in the council too, and that is democracy, I suppose, to a certain extent.
So, in terms of the policy itself then, give me a sense of some of the details. What does it cover, first of all?
Yes, so policy, so it's worth saying we had a pre-existing advertising and sponsorship policy, and that, I would say, was pretty basic. So it did call out things like the council wasn't to advertise tobacco products or alcohol or gambling, things like that, which you might sort of expect to see. What it didn't do was go into any level of detail beyond that. So the decision that we actually took earlier this year was about revising that policy. And the revisions that we were talking about were motivated by a motion that I brought a couple of years ago, like I say, to sort of develop it into an ethical advertising and sponsorship policy was how we termed it. So the things that came forward from the officer side of things, so from the people that are actually working on the policy in the background, that was to include the prohibition of advertising to promote high carbon products. So that includes things like airlines and airports, fossil fuel companies. So that was all firms, sub-brands, lobbying organisations that are related to the distribution or sale of fossil fuels. And I think really importantly, that also included, irrespective of their potential sustainability commitments. So it's not the case that we're saying that it's acceptable for us to have an advert from BP if there's a picture of a wind farm on it. We've taken the decision that actually no fossil fuel companies, full stop, we will not be engaging with. And the policy also included excluding advertising and promotion for petrol, diesel and hybrid vehicles, which was really good, and also all SUVs as well. So the policy still allows battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fueled vehicles, but not if they are SUVs. So it was actually quite comprehensive in terms of what came forward from the environmental side of things. The additional thing that we managed to add into the mix, which we were really pleased about, was also this prohibition of companies that are involved in arms manufacturing. So we do have examples, or we have historically had examples of billboards, bus stops and the like, advertising companies that are involved in arms manufacturing. And again, we sort of took the view that actually, as a council, we've taken a position on things like supporting a ceasefire in Gaza. It doesn't make sense for us to be coming out with those kinds of statements and then at the same time be taking money from the companies that are making money from the war. So we managed to get that kind of additional bit added into, which we were really pleased about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The kind of prohibition on arms manufacturers is really interesting as well, and I guess potentially a source of pushback on this because the arms industry in the UK is huge, right? Big money, big employer. So did you get that kind of pushback when you were putting this policy through?
We did. To be very honest with you, that was the bit that we were quite surprised that we got over the line. So we felt quite comfortable that. Well, we felt quite certain we would get something in terms of the environmental stuff. We weren't sure whether we were going to get a total ban on fossil fuel companies. We weren't sure that we were going to get things on airlines and airports. We also managed to get cruise ships in there as well. Actually, I think I forgot to mention that. So we were comfortable that we would get some of that. We weren't sure at all that we were going to get the arms manufacturers. But again, I think, the conversation where we sort of came to as part of the committee discussion was actually, well, what is advertising for? And I suppose once you start to actually tap into that in a little bit more detail, I think arguments around the fact that actually, fossil fuel companies, arms manufacturers, they have a right to use public space to promote their messages, the greenwashing that we see, those arguments don't really stand up to scrutiny in the same way. So I suppose, it's a challenging conversation. There are still things that I would like to see on that list of things that we don't accept advertising from. So meat and dairy is one, again, which I think is a massive black hole in terms of the conversation around climate sometimes. I actually think, again, the council has made commitments. So we signed up to the plant-based treaty at the end of last year, which is all about having that conversation around what does the consumption of meat and dairy mean for the climate, and sort of making the case that actually we need to see a transition to a plant-based food system. That's not represented in the advertising sponsorship policy as it stands. So there are other things, like I say, that we probably all personally and politically within different political groups would take a different view on. I think arms manufacturing, we weren't expecting a majority to come with us, but we were delighted that they did. So it's really positive.
Yeah, extremely positive. So I'm just picking up on the meat and dairy point then. Why was that not included this time round?
Yeah, that is a good question. I suppose, to be very honest, I think because it's a difficult conversation. So a year ago, the council did endorse the plant-based treaty, as I've referenced, and that was all about having a conversation around the impact of food systems on climate and nature emergencies. And I think we'd identified, a bit like we'd identified a hole in our advertising and sponsorship policy, I think we'd identified a hole in the council's approach to food, which was not really recognising the relationship between food systems and climate change. And we sort of managed to do some work to look at that, and we now have a whole action plan which is looking at that transition away from meat and dairy and towards more sustainable food systems and plant-based foods. I think that conversation was complicated, and to be honest, the council got a lot of lobbying from different parts of the industry, and I think that maybe it was too soon, maybe it would be too sensitive for us to look at that. Again, I think I would like us to be able to look at this policy again. It should come back for sort of sign off and rubber stamping on an annual basis anyway. I think that there is scope for us to recognise that actually all of the fear-mongering, because the other conversation that was happening around this obviously was, oh, well, if we introduce these prohibitions on certain products, then the council's going to lose lots of money and it's going to be a disaster. Mm-hmm. I think what we're going to see is that doesn't really stand up, and actually instead it's about the council using its influence and recognising that actually where we've taken a position on an issue, so whether it is plant-based foods, whether it is cars and sustainable travel, whether it is cruise ships, fossil fuel companies, whatever it is, it's perfectly legitimate for us to say that actually if there's going to be advertising in the city, then we want to make sure that it's advertising that we can recognise as not being harmful. So I think the door is open, I guess, for us to have that conversation. And again, I think that's that same point of how do we make sure that the council's approach to all of these issues is consistent across the board. I think we can have that conversation about meat and dairy, but maybe this year was just too soon. So maybe that's next year's conversation. We'll get back to you.
Yeah. Of all these issues, meat and dairy really is the one that stands out as the most difficult to have. It's not quite there yet, is it? Unfortunately, it's really interesting to hear you talk about just like the level of, I guess, debate that was happening behind the scenes, and how this really was a case of, a lot of back and forth between lots of competing interests. Because one thing that in our work at Free Cities, when we're working with councils, one thing we hear a lot is, councillors worried about how do you actually define these things? Like, they might say, well, yeah, we want this ethical advertising policy and we want to stop ads for these harmful products, but we're worried about how you actually define that in a policy. And then the risk, of course, is if you don't define it properly, you leave yourself open to legal challenges, or, just those kind of silly things like with the Transport for London junk food ban, and like Ed Gamble's, the comedian, his tour poster got banned because it had a hot dog on it, and then that's like national news, and it's very embarrassing. So anyway, it's a fear for a lot of councils that if you can't accurately define these things, then you can't take action. But clearly, you can, because Edinburgh has. So how did you get around that? And what advice would you have for another council that was thinking about this but had those concerns?
Yeah, I suppose I think those are really good points. I suppose the thing that's good is that Edinburgh has done it. So I guess if any other council wants to look at what an ethical advertising and sponsorship policy looks like, and if they want a list of how do you write the magic words that ban fossil fuel companies, well, we've got it in that policy. It's publicly available, so please copy and paste it. I suppose this is where I would say that point that I made earlier around, I thought this might be a quick win, and then 2 years later we were still plugging away trying to get something over the line. I think it is about opening up the conversation. So our role as councillors is to set the strategic direction of the council. We don't get involved in operational issues. It's not my job to write the policy. It's my job to take advice. If I bring forward a motion that says we should create a policy that tries to achieve X, Y, and Z, if officers turn around and say that's going to be really difficult for A, B, and C reasons, it's my job to listen and try and work out what is possible. I suppose that's where I would say, obviously, at Free Cities, you've been great in terms of advice and support and all of those things. The other thing that we had that was really beneficial, and I will give them a little shout out, we had the Mothers Climate Action Network. So they have a local group in Edinburgh who were really, really brilliant on this, and actually they kept coming back to committee, they kept emailing committee members. So every committee cycle that came by and the advertising sponsorship policy wasn't on the agenda, they were getting in touch with everyone and saying, where is it? We want to see it. We think that this is possible. We think that this is something the council should be doing. So, some really good campaign work from them. And again, I think it's about all of those different bits of the puzzle coming together. So like I say, you've got third sector organisations, voluntary groups, activists putting pressure on councillors, who are working with council officers who I guess are able to look at that wider piece. And now that we've got a policy in place, and there are other parts of the UK that have done it too. So actually my first motion made reference to other parts of the UK where advertising sponsorship policies have been passed and changed in these ways. So I think it's that classic movement building piece. I think that for me, the thing that's really exciting about Edinburgh doing it is that we are the capital city of Scotland, and actually that means that we have got a level of influence and a level of sway, which I think hopefully will make it a little bit easier for other local authorities to follow suit.
Cough, cough, London, cough, cough, cough. If you're listening, Sadiq Khan, a regular listener to the Ad Free Cities podcast, I'm sure. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so the policy, advertising and sponsorship policy is absolutely wonderful, and really hope that it sets a precedent for other councils to follow. But it does have its limits, right? I mean, it only affects advertising sites on council-owned properties, right? So we're talking about bus shelters and ad panels on kind of public infrastructure. So in terms of going forwards from this, in terms of next steps, what would you like to see happen next, and what further influence could the council have in Edinburgh to reduce the presence of these kinds of harmful advertising in our lives?
Yeah, so I think influence is a really, really good word for that, because actually I think sometimes people misunderstand the level of influence the council has on these things. I think sometimes people overestimate it, but then I also think sometimes on the flip side, people underestimate it a lot too. So as you mentioned, so the policy that we've got, it covers council properties, it covers council land, council owned assets, bus stops, things like that. But there are other, we call them arm's length external organisations. And this is basically council speak for companies which are owned by the council but managed externally. So in Edinburgh, we have things like the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, things like the trams and the buses, Edinburgh Leisure, so all the leisure facilities in the city. They're all these arm's length external organisations. And there's a big tricky question around the governance of these. And actually at the moment within the council, we're looking at a big governance review to ask exactly that question of, well, what does it mean for the council to own these assets, which again are quite sizable, because suddenly we're looking at all of the council-owned gyms, we're looking at the trams, the buses, all the rest of it. what does it mean for us to own those, but for them to be managed externally? Which of the council policies, things like advertising and sponsorship, but also things like paying a real living wage to employees, all those sorts of things, which of those council policies definitely apply in those instances? And all of the, contracts and agreements that we have with those companies for them to be managed externally, what are we baking into those agreements to make sure that actually the council's view on things is sufficiently represented? So from my perspective, as part of this governance review, we're going to be fighting tooth and nail to make sure that the advertising sponsorship policy and a whole load of other things that we think are important that the council does well are baked into those contracts, so that those sorts of organisations have to abide by those policies too. One thing that was really interesting, and this was something which didn't pass when we brought the amendment to the policy when it came forward. So we were successful in adding in the piece about arms manufacturers, but we also tried to sneak in a little line which just said, also we agree that alios will abide by this policy too. And we were basically told, no, you can't just do that, Ben. You're chancing your arm on that. So we need to find a different way of making that happen. But I'm confident we will. I think there are other parts where the council does have influence too. So we've got very good relationships with the universities, for example. There's a lot of things as a university city where the council is routinely working in collaboration with the universities, and actually some of the work we've been doing on the plant-based treaty that I referenced earlier too, we've got quite a few joint actions which are looking at how university campuses are kind of responding to the changes that are being called for as part of that treaty. And I think that we can start to have these conversations with those other bodies and partners that the council is in constant communication with to say, look, the council has done this. We've actually got a citywide, we have a citywide board, for example, that looks at becoming a net zero city by 2030. We have partners, the NHS, the universities, like I mentioned, they all sit on that. So actually, how are we using our influence as a council in all of those spaces to say, look, we've passed this policy, we think you should do so too. So I suppose, the next piece of work is, again, identifying the gaps. It's that same point again, identifying the gaps where nobody's quite bothered to look before, and trying to extend, whether it is about extending the council's influence or using the council's influence that it already has to the greatest possible extent to make sure that this policy, and like I say, all of the good things that the council does, is represented there too. But again, I think part of that also has to involve that conversation with activist groups and other parts of society to try and help this become a bit of a moment and a bit of a movement. I suppose the final thing I'd say on that, it was quite pleasing because actually the week that we managed to get the policy through was the same week that the UN came out and said that greenwashing and advertising for fossil fuel companies or high carbon products was a bad thing. So it did feel like we were just ever so slightly ahead of the curve on that, which was a really good feeling. And actually I think that momentum we saw over the summer as well in terms of conversations about sponsorship of the festivals, the book festival, Bailey Gifford, all that sort of stuff was kind of coming to a head. So I guess the question is, how do we capture all of those different ideas and different people who've been motivated to get involved in those conversations to try and carry this forward?
Yeah, that's super exciting. And you referenced there, it was the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, did a speech. He called out fossil fuel advertisers, madmen fueling the madness, he called them. It was a big moment. It was a big moment for us. It was at the same time as the Euros were happening, so when everyone else in the country was pinned to their screens watching the football, all of us at Ad Free Cities were pinned to our laptops watching Antonio Guterres make a speech. Little insight into the world of Ad Free Cities there. So you may have seen earlier this year, back in July, the Swiss city Vernier, just outside Geneva, the city council there actually voted to get rid of the city's billboards, not just control the advertising, but actually get rid of the infrastructure. And a huge move, and I'm sure controversial. But I was just wondering, from your perspective, what would it take for a UK city to do the same? Is that even possible under UK kind of planning law? And if not, what are the barriers to doing that, and how do we overcome those?
That's a very large question, James. So I suppose on planning, the one thing that I would say is that we have different planning laws and planning systems. So in Scotland, the picture is very different to in England. So there's that whole conversation that needs to be had as part of this. I suppose for me, and I think there would be a real anxiety from a lot of councils around that, because actually advertising, whether we like it or not, is a way of the council generating revenue, and at a time when budgets are extremely tight because we've had a sustained period of austerity which doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. The public sector is really stretched for resources, so I think that would be difficult. I suppose if I can reframe the question ever so slightly, maybe the conversation we need to be having is more about, well, what is an advert and what is an advert for? So actually the Mothers Climate Action Network group that I referenced earlier, they were very good on this when they came in to speak to councillors and to address the committee, because they were sort of asking questions about, well, why can't we, for example, look at having an advertising policy that only supports local businesses, or it supports arts companies, or other things like that, which actually are much more aligned with council values. They're much more the sorts of things that we say. I think you speak to anybody in the street and they would say, well, yeah, of course I want to support small business, of course I want to support local businesses over multinationals. So actually, is it more about us having a conversation around, well, how do we want advertising to serve us? And then I suppose the question is, if there are no good reasons, and if we think it is just a blanket bad, then maybe we do need to start looking at how we can take that off our streets. But if actually there are some instances where we say, well, actually, it would be cool if actually all of the adverts that we saw across the city were for local business, or other conditions that you could put on it. Maybe then actually that becomes a change to the way that we contract out things like the bus stops and benches and phone boxes and all the rest of it, where you see these things popping up across the city. So I think, that's probably where, in my head, the conversation needs to go next. I suspect as part of that conversation, my view would be we probably do need less adverts. Whether that means that we want none whatsoever, I'm not so sure. But I think, let's start by answering the question, what is an advert for? And then I think that gets us kind of further along that discussion point.
Ben, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been a fantastic chat.
Not a problem. Thank you very much for having me.
Wow, really exciting progress in Edinburgh there. Well done to everyone who was involved in that, and to the Mothers Climate Action Network for keeping the pressure on. Hey, it sounds like we need to check back in with Ben sometime about getting rid of the billboards. So this point about councils joining up their thinking, this will apply to most or all other councils. So if you're listening, councillors, check out our website for ways that you can do this too. And listeners, you can write to your councillors to let them know you want to see actions against harmful polluting ads too. Now, James, there are a couple of things I think people might be wondering about. The first one is, we know that both Sheffield and Edinburgh, they both included all petrol cars, including hybrid cars, in their advertising restrictions. And some people might be confused by that, as we're generally led to believe that hybrid cars are a good thing. And I know car advertising is a particular interest of yours, so can you explain why a council would want to end ads for hybrid cars?
Quite simply, hybrid cars still rely predominantly on fossil fuels. Because of how the engines work, it's fossil fuels that go in and convert to electricity, and so they still generate emissions and pollution and all the bad stuff. We can explore the whole murky world of car advertising in a future episode, but that's the long and short of it. Now, there's also, of course, the thorny issue of meat and dairy ads, which were not included in the Edinburgh policy either, as we heard from Ben. And that's more your wheelhouse, Nicola. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it was really promising that Edinburgh seriously considered including meat and dairy as a restricted type of advertising, but ultimately it's still seen as too controversial an area, as Ben said. But really, it's no less important because of that. We know that we need to dramatically reduce demand for meat and dairy, which are huge drivers of the climate crisis, nature depletion, not to mention animal cruelty, and any advertising for these industries is a big part of the solution. So how about we look more into that in a future episode?
Sounds good.
Great. So back to fossil fuel ads then. Where does this leave us?
Well, yeah, good question. Where does this leave us? I mean, obviously great progress to see these kind of policies, being enacted. And I suppose it's worth mentioning, just as we're recording this, we had the stunning news from The Hague in the Netherlands, where the city has actually introduced not just a motion, but a law banning high carbon advertising across the city there. So this really is like world leading stuff. A motion is one thing, but that's like essentially an agreement. A statement of intent by a council, whereas what The Hague has done is introduced a locally binding piece of legislation.
Oh, that's great news.
I actually don't know if that's even possible in the UK. Do we have that kind of thing? I don't know. I don't know if UK councils can do that. But we should definitely find out, and if they can, we should push for that. Yeah, but by way of summary, I suppose, like reducing advertising for fossil fuels is fantastic, right? But what we really want is an end to the use of fossil fuels in themselves. So similarly, while reducing the presence of fossil fuel advertising is great, what we want to see is less advertising altogether, right? Because for every type of harmful product advertising that we remove, something else will take its place. We banned cigarette advertising 20 years ago, and now, right, it's junk food adverts, and it's vaping adverts, and it's high carbon adverts, right? So it's basically a game of whack-a-mole if you do it this way. The solution to that long term is to get rid of the advertising space itself, and that means taking down the billboards, right? Getting rid of ad space in our towns and cities, and using those spaces instead for trees, for nature, for art, for community space, for whatever else we might want to see. And for that, we've said this in previous episodes, we'll doubtless say it again, we need reform of the planning system. And that's something that we're currently feeding into the government about. And we need national bans on the most harmful ads that we've talked about today.
Okay, so lots of stuff that we've covered there today. A really interesting topic that I'm sure will just keep evolving in the future. And I'm looking forward to seeing what other councils will do. So let's talk about this again in a future episode, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Watch this space. Like I say, at time of recording, The Hague came out with this kind of out the blue. So this is a rapidly evolving space. So definitely keep your eyes on the prize. Yeah, thanks again to Ben Parker for joining us this week, for giving us the interview.
Great. See you next time.
Speak soon.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, then please subscribe, and if you can, please share this podcast with a friend or two. To find out more about Ad-Free Cities' work, head to adfreecities.org.uk or find us on Twitter and Instagram at @AdFreeCities. Thanks for listening, and fuck adverts.